So, I'm trying. I know my sound is better. Good evening. Hello. This is Keisha, again, your friendly neighborhood Black feminist geographer. And I want to apologize first for my first video and the audio problems. I have switched to a new device, my old iPhone. And so we'll figure out if this works better. I started to set up and it looks all calm back here, but I got wires because everything is low battery power. But you know, hey, it is what it is. I'm here to talk about, in the midst of everything that might be going on right now, all in due time, honey. But I wanted to expand upon the concept that I talked about last time in my barely heard audio. And I wanted to again talk about passport privilege, but not in the way that you think I'm talking about it. So I wanted to just define it last time, and then I wanted to to explain, what it is and why you should take advantage of that, particularly if you are from the U.S. or North America, in Europe, if you, as a Black woman, how you should take advantage and get your passport. And I hope I inspired some people to think about it, open up that file, go to the DS.gov, go to the State Department website, figure out what it was about. Maybe I reminded someone to renew, yay. So today, your friendly Black feminist geographer. This channel is all about Black women and space and resistance. And I want to talk to you about something related to passport privilege and critical geography, to talk about how borders themselves, the idea of nation states that issue passports and govern immigration IM and immigration EM out, that's all BS. So borders, nation states, BS. And that's as far as I can curse as far as the YouTube algorithm. But before I jump into that, why I say that related to passport privilege, if we just flip it on its head from a critical geography standpoint and say that borders themselves are BS, I want to stop for a minute and ask you if you like what you hear, if you're interested in hearing more. I would love for you to join my channel. So take this moment right now and subscribe to this channel. I would love to build my base. I would love to have a conversation with other women, Black women who are thinking about space and travel in this world, and how space is being reorganized, and how there are some badassery things that are going on to resist these borders. And so take a moment to subscribe. I'll wait. Okay, thank you. Also, like this video. Please feel free to send me comments if something that I say here really sparks you. So let's get back. Why are you saying that borders themselves are BS? Well, because they are. And if we step back, we know, remember in elementary school, we learned the United States, and we saw our map, and we saw the states, and we were given a map of the country, of the world, in a very objective way. This is the world, and these are the continents, and these are the oceans. Remember that? Yeah, that's all BS. The question that you never may have asked when you're in elementary school, and maybe not even asked yesterday before you watch this, is who drew those borders? Why is this place called what it is? And who was so important? Who had that much power to reinscribe a space that this is it, this is mine, and you people around me can't get in? I regulate that. I say that who can leave, and I can dictate who can come in, right? And very much this political moment right now is all about these borders. in crossing these borders and military operations to erase borders, erase the people that they don't want in those borders. And so I want us to think a little bit right now about borders, the idea from passports to nation states that issue them, to the faux illusion, the illusion that there are these spaces bounded by things. Who have the audacity and the power to map the spaces as they are? And so let me walk you through the why again of why borders are BS. 3 things. And then I'm gonna provide real examples that's gonna make you scratch your head, and you will never look at a map the same again as you plan your trips, right, with your passport. Number 1, those who drew those borders were typically the, if you understand power as those who dominate and those who are subordinated, and I'm really talking about power in that way, those who had the power to draw those borders imposed borders based on their perspective, okay? They aren't necessarily the indigenous people of that space that they have now reclaimed, drawn lines around, and proclaimed that it is this, right? In history, it's almost never the case that there is an invader, okay? And they win or they lose. And when they win, they draw lines, okay? Every space that we see in this map has been fought over, has been negotiated, not in a necessarily a gentleman fashion, but maybe. They've been negotiated under threat, right? And so borders are generally drawn based on some campaign, some militaristic campaign, under threat, under siege, under immoral state violent actions, okay? They are drawn by one perspective of a perhaps contested space. And this is not just historical. Like, we can think, okay, so why did North Dakota become this or whatever? But we are seeing today contemporary problems that have manifest themselves based on these historical remapping of spaces. Stay with me now, because I have examples of this. Okay, so remember, borders are BS. Why, Keisha? Number 1, because they're immoral. They're usually a threat of siege, of war. It is the strategy of subordinates and dominance. The winners are drawing these lines. Number 2, I've been pretty, nice in saying this, but borders are drawn by the colonizers, okay? All of these lines have been drawn by colonizers, okay? And we'll talk about that. And then second, just because I want you to understand this not as someday someone in 1804 wrote down and made a map and put a name on it, these borders are sometimes constantly being negotiated, okay? The most recent example of border negotiations, borders coming down, borders being erected, is a new state, the relatively new state within the last, I want to say at this point, maybe 8 years, of South Sudan as a result of civil war, right? And borders are shifting and changing. We think of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? And independent nation states that are coming about for that. So borders are not just drawn one time, okay? Borders are constantly being fought over, renegotiation, won and lost, okay? So these, I want you to walk away understanding that borders are dynamic. And I want you to walk away thinking about borders are dynamic Because if borders are being drawn in a contest between domination and subordination, then there is some resistance to that border. Every border has been resisted. Believe that. So looking back at my notes, I want you to remember that, okay? Borders are BS. Why are they BS? Immoral, state intervention, state violence, usually the result of colonization. And borders are dynamic. They're changing. They feel very real to us. When we had that Rand McNally map, okay, we don't use that anymore. We use Google Maps, right? I know. I still like paper maps, but I'm a geographer. But they're being resisted. Spaces are being resisted at the block. Sometimes at the block level, right on that corner, sometimes that building is taken over. But they're being resisted in terms of communities, in terms of cities, in terms of territories, in terms of nation states. Like there's this thing and it's dynamic, and those borders are being renegotiated and resisted and redrawn all the time. We can think of our congressional. I don't want to talk about elections. I know people are really soft about that. We're going to get to all that. Not this video. This video is talking about borders or BS. So I want to talk about some cases, some really important examples of how borders are not these flat, one-time things that we tend to understand them to be, and how they're not objective at all. That there's a war going on. Sorry, I moved the whole table. That there is a war going on under the surface. That there is a resistance to this of being drawn upon by the indigenous folks that are there. And that colonizers stay colonizing. That ain't stopped. They do it in new ways now. I mean, they don't, go down to the sea invading, with their army. There are other ways. So I want to give you, how many examples do I have? Because I want to make this, just a piece and not a lecture. I really don't. I want to talk about how many cases? 4. You gonna stay with me for 4 cases of why this works and why I chose them. I chose them because they're very different places, very different times, but still you will find the state violence, colonization, and dynamic. So I think the most obvious one to talk about, the one that is currently we see before our eyes as a contestation of space, is what we see right now in terms of the Israeli war and the genocide that we see happening in Gaza into Palestinians. Those lines were drawn. We can see the proclamation of that space of being a Jewish territory, the Palestinian region around 1948 by the great colonizer, Britain. And since that moment, I think it was about 1948, since that moment, it has been this battle and contestation over space. Before it was declared to be a space for Jewish people, primarily from fleeing the growing anti-Semitism that we saw in Europe. It was a place for members of the former Ottoman Empire, right? It was a space. People inhabited that space. And in my recollection, those people were not asked, And this is not a Team Israel, Team Palestinian thing. This is about the dynamics of space. It was rendered space by even a third power in a colonizing project, right? And so since that space was declared, that space has been a site of ongoing conflict. I'm going to put in the description a really good story of that territory by Al Jazeera. It talks about the Palestinian territory in a series of 6 maps and how that map has been redrawn, and how even at this moment it continuously is a site of contestation and domination and subordination and of suffering. So I think that's an example that you can look into. And I know that understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is difficult and hard and complex. I want you to maybe use the perspective of space and the contestation over the Gaza Strip as a really one pathway to understand it. So I'll put the link to the Al Jazeera article showing the map of this contested space over 6 maps over time. It's very fascinating. So let's move to something closer to home if you're from a North American context. And let's talk about the US. Okay, the 50 states. That was a completely colonizing project. From the last state that was introduced into the Union to the US territories that people forget are in this liminal space of being not quite a state, but not independent. And some people are like, gee, you don't need a passport to go here. So we have places like Guam, and we have places like, of course, like Puerto Rico. We have the very bloody history of the colonizing project in the statehood, in Hawaii statehood. And we have the story of Alaskan statehood, and we have the continuing resistance to colonial domination or unequal representation in the fight for statehood for both Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. Yes, Washington, D.C. Has not the benefits of state, has representation, just like the U.S. Virgin Islands has a representative in Congress without any voting power. Girls, y'all, it's crazy. So the U.S., to be really, the U.S. in of itself, the map that we see, where we have to know the state's capitals, and we just gloss over and give students this map, objectively talking about a very bloody colonizing project of stripping indigenous people off of their land, reclaiming land and spaces, and the continuing saga. I live in Onondaga Territory in upstate New York, and the Onondaga people are still fighting with the US government over treaty violations. Okay, we may not understand what's going on, but the resistance is very real hundreds of years later. So we understand projects like the Discovery Doctrine, as well as ideas, American ideas such as manifest destiny, that called upon a religious basis, theoretical foundation for taking over lands that don't belong to you, then claiming it. And it's also this colonizing project of, this free space for people to lay claim to, is also what makes problematic 40 acres is a mule, because the U.S. didn't own the 40 acres to give us any mules or 40 acres, y'all. But that's another story. We'll get deep into that. That's problematic from an indigenous perspective. So if we go even further south, the irony of, anger about the southern border is the idea that, hello, all of that land was Aztlan, okay? That land belonged to the indigenous people, okay? And if anybody is an illegal immigrant, it's the sons and daughters of European colonists, right? So again, a map that we see, the things that we're taught, and we gloss over the fact that they are projects of domination and subordination. And these borders are false at best. At worst, they are a very violent campaign to take over indigenous lands. I'll give you a European one just for shits and giggles. Can you curse in these things? Anyway, we have East and West Germany. And what you know about that, the creation of the Berlin Wall post-World War II, where East Germany, West in Germany was separated. One was communist, one was democratic-led. And this is a different scenario than the one that I just talked about previously, because it was actually drawn. That wall and that border was created to keep people from going to the other side. That is a different scenario in terms of the theoretical foundation of creating that border to make sure that East Germans did not flee to the West and weaken the communist state. And we know that with the fall of the Soviet Union, that also weakened the strength of that, and that wall came down. But I want to, if I can't do anything else, because I'm always about the diaspora, is perhaps the largest and the fastest and the largest, the sheer space of taking over happened in 1884 to 1885 in a series of talks called the Berlin Conference, also known as the Scramble for Africa. And although the event, I apologize for that. Although it's given the name Berlin, it was definitely initiated primarily by Leopold of Belgium. And what he wanted was the Congo. And everybody wanted a piece. Everybody, meaning the colonial powers in Europe, the ones that remained in that era. Everybody wanted a piece of Africa. And I show in my class what Africa looked like in terms of European colonization in 1880 versus what it looked like right before World War I is incredible. What you will see, and I'll put a link to the map as well, is that just the edges of the continent is marked by a European colonizer footprint. But in a series of meetings over 1884 and 1885, the colonial powers got together and divided up Africa in gentlemen agreements for themselves. You'll see common pictures of these men, white men, like cutting up Africa, carving up Africa like cake. Here's a piece for you, Portugal, and here's a piece for you, France, and don't forget about you, Britain, right? And that's exactly what they did. It was a gentleman's club of calmly sitting down and taking pieces of land, of people, indigenous people's land that did not belong to them. Creating borders that did not exist for the indigenous tribes that are in them. It was sweeping. And we can see the contestation and the impacts of that today. Belgium owes its riches to the Congo. And again, that's a whole nother story. If you want to hear more about it, that's great. In my research to do this, because I talk about that, it is a pivotal moment in the diaspora when Africa is carved up, and in this period between the 1880s and the 19-teens, early 19-teens, that every piece of Africa has touched and been carved and claimed by European powers. Although Ethiopia was able to resist it, yay Ethiopia, that's a great story. And within that story about Ethiopia doing it is the story of this leader, Menelik, and he writes this letter, which is fascinating. But I wanted to show you again how borders were BS. And when you're traveling and you got this passport privilege, while we do live by these borders, it's important to be critical of of who made this the line, who were they keeping in, and who were they keeping out, and who are they letting move freely through that. So just a little nugget about passport privilege from a critical geography perspective. Again, I'll provide links with the Al Jazeera piece about Palestine, Palestinian territory, and I'll also provide a map or some link to talk very briefly about the Scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference. But I think that's an important conversation to have. So what do you do with all this information, right? I think you can be a more critical scholar, a more critical thinker about borders and what they really mean. You'll see kind of there's a current movement. I can only report on it. I don't know if it's effective, but there is a growing movement to acknowledge in addresses, at least in a university setting, that land is, that the space that we inhabit is on Indigenous land. And so there are usually land acknowledgements, particularly by progressive organizations or organizations who try to act like they're progressive. And so there's a moment of acknowledging the Indigenous land that it's upon when you're at a conference or whatever. Now, if you're anything like when I am in a program where they do a land acknowledgement, there's always a group of people that say, give it back. And so that's why I can't really say how effective or useful land acknowledgements are. Are they simply performative and they don't mean anything? Does the collective suffering from taking away a land, are you in any means addressing it by saying we are on the former territories of? I like to be a little bit positive in this, and again, I know for some people it's just progressive performance, progressive being performative. I recognize that, but I also believe that it does create a consciousness that if you know where you are, if you know that is contested space and you acknowledge that contested space, it gives you a consciousness of understanding. So one more thing I'll link, because I think that this is really important. You want to go back. There is a group that is working on an Indigenous lands cartography project. It's a group based in Canada, and they have mapped out a global map of Indigenous lands. So I think that I'll give this to you, I'll put this in the descriptive again. Find out what land that you sit on, what Indigenous land territory is it a part of. So you should know it. I think it's good. And for some of you, the knowledge in and of itself is great. Some people go a little bit further and they do put it as part of their email signature. They acknowledge it in their writings. They support efforts to commemorate and memorialize specific historic sites. So that's an action that you can take. At first, acknowledge it, and then see if there are any opportunities to do more beyond a performative, I acknowledge that I am on an ancestral lands. So do that. And get your organizations, your social groups, your civic groups, to do the same in acknowledging that it is on Indigenous lands. That's one thing that you could do. So I'm gonna send you that, find out where you are, and then, comment. Say, Keisha, I find out that I'm in, this territory, and I didn't know I was in this territory, and it's very interesting to me. So let me know if you find out something new about the territory, the ancestral land that you sit on, and definitely let me know if you have found examples of how to take this from just a land acknowledgement to something that addresses social injustice, to address an injustice. Let's get started with this conversation. And of course, comment on anything. If you want to hear more, I can talk an entire episode on King Leopold in Belgium. That gets me angry, which hundreds of years later. I can talk about any of these kind of land contestations in and of themselves. This is just scratching the surface. You can look at the trajectory of each of the 54 countries that were taken and divided up among imperial powers, of their trajectory, and how the impact of drawing those borders still affect the communities and tribes and social life today. It's a real thing. So I would love to get feedback. I would love to talk more on these or even provide more examples. But yeah, I think my work is done. So make sure, again, that you like and that you share. I think this is an interesting conversation to have with some of your civic groups about we should acknowledge the land that we are on. And I would love to hear how that's working for you. Okay? Until next time.